For more than a century, as the drums of war echoed across Europe, a single word was enough to chill the blood of the enemy: Tercios. They were neither randomly levied armies nor undisciplined hordes. They were men forged in gunpowder, in faith, in loyalty, and in hunger. Soldiers who marched in the name of an empire on which the sun never set, bearing the embroidered cross on their breast and steel always at the ready. Among their ranks stood impoverished hidalgos, hardened peasants, and veterans who feared nothing. They fought in Flanders, Italy, the Caribbean, and the Pyrenees. They faced Turks, French, English, Dutch, Protestants, and privateers. And almost always, against all odds, they endured. For the Tercios were not merely a military force. They were a way of understanding the world. A fusion of iron discipline, personal courage, and a mystique of war that still astonishes historians and strategists today. Their enemies saw them as a human bulwark, their allies as a last hope. They slept little, ate less, but never wavered. Standing firm, in rain or fire, they held formation. And when the clarion sounded, they advanced with the slow, deadly step of those who fear nothing, even death itself. This is not just a story of battles, it is the story of an elite. The story of men who lived and died to the rhythm of powder, honor, and endurance. The Spanish Tercios, honor, steel. At the beginning of the 16th century, the world was changing. Gunpowder was replacing the steel of knights. Ancient walls could no longer stop cannon fire, and medieval kingdoms were transforming into global empires. Amid this transformation, the Spanish Empire, under the reign of Charles I, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, needed a military force capable of meeting the challenge, to fight on multiple fronts, maintain order across vast territories, and confront enemies as varied as the northern Protestants, the Ottomans in the east, or the French across the Pyrenees. Thus, the Tercios were born. Not by chance, nor out of tradition. They were a conscious creation, the result of strategic necessity and a far-reaching imperial vision. The age of heavy cavalry was over. The Tercios broke with the feudal military model. They were professional infantry, disciplined, cohesive, and capable of withstanding cavalry charges, enemy fire, and the harshest conditions. Their tactical core was a lethal combination: pikemen to hold the line, arquebusiers, and musketeers to harass and break formations, and swordsmen for close combat. Unlike the disorganized mercenary armies of the time, the Tercios were precisely structured, divided into companies under the command of experienced captains, with officers who rose through merit, not just noble birth. But they were not just soldiers. In them, faith, hunger, and pride were woven together. Many were impoverished hidalgos, hardened peasants, or veterans of countless campaigns. Their unity did not come from blood, but from oath. Their discipline was harsh, almost inhuman, and yet they accepted it, because they knew that being part of a tercio was not just about serving. It meant belonging to an elite force that marched with the cross embroidered on their chest as the armed arm of an empire upon which the sun never set. The name Tercio originated from the three initial great units operating in the Italian territories: Lombardy, Naples, and Sicily. Over time, the term came to designate an entire military organization that would spread across Europe and the world. They evolved, adapted, changed in number and composition, but preserved their essence. Because beyond structure, beyond weaponry, what defined them was spirit. The belief that no charge, no bullet, no betrayal could break a soldier of the Tercios. Thus the myth began, not as some ancient legend, but as a reality feared by every enemy of the empire. The history of the 16th century cannot be understood without them. They were more than a military force. They were a mindset, a way of being in the world. And what began as an emperor's experiment ended as one of the most formidable formations in military history. The glory of the Tercios was not forged solely on the battlefield. It was woven, day by day, in the harshness of the camps, in the discipline of the road, in the heat of the marshes and the cold of the trenches. To understand their resilience, one must look beyond strategy and steel and see the man holding the pike. That man could be a fallen noble, a landless peasant, an adventurer seeking fame, or a condemned soul for whom war offered redemption. All of them had a place in the Tercios. All were judged by their courage. Their life was hard, unpredictable. The soldier lived with the bare minimum: a blanket, a wooden bowl, a pouch with dry bread or bacon. Pay when it arrived was often delayed, but that wasn't what kept him there. It was the esprit de corps, the brotherhood that united men across the long marshes of the Spanish road, the route that connected Lombardy to Flanders and along which entire columns moved, crossing borders, bridges, and hostility. They spoke Spanish, Italian, Flemish. They shared songs, rations, silences, and also punishments. Because discipline was severe, theft, desertion, or disobedience could cost one's life. The soldier of the Tercios was no automaton. He prayed fervently before each battle. He kissed the crucifix embroidered on his banner. He carried images of saints sewn into his doublet, but he was also superstitious. He feared the evil eye, the fate written in the stars, the silence of crows in gray dawns. On nights without combat, around the fire, they recited old ballads, told ghost stories about abandoned fortresses, or of women waiting in distant ports. Thus, in the middle of gunpowder and mud, a deeply rooted oral culture remained alive. The flag was not just a military symbol. It was the soul of the Tercio. Each company had its own, hand-embroidered, often bearing Marian devotions or references to the patron saints of their place of origin. If the flag fell, morale collapsed. Ensigns knew that dying for it was an honorable fate. Alongside the flag there was music. Drums and fifes set the marching rhythm, gave signals for attack or retreat, and lifted spirits during the harshest moments. During campaigns, the Tercios endured hunger, cold, and disease, scurvy, dysentery, fever. And yet, they held on. Mutinies were common, yes, but not from disloyalty, from desperation. Many went years without pay. Still, when it was time to fight, they took up the pike as if nothing else mattered. Because the honor of the Tercio was not negotiable. Because to fail in battle was a greater shame than starving. Their camps were like moving cities. Between battles, tents were raised, trenches dug, and guard shifts, cooking, and prayers were organized. Women were not absent from this life. Some followed the Tercios as sutlers, nurses, or wives. Others were part of the war's spoils or the tragedies it left behind. But all were part of the story. In their free time, soldiers played dice, sharpened weapons, or wrote letters that might never arrive. Some composed verses like Cervantes. Others sang them quietly, as if trying to remember who they were before they wore the doublet. The soldier of the Tercio lived between glory and misery. And yet, when someone asked where he came from, one word was enough to say everything: from the Tercios. When the smoke of gunpowder was still a mystery on the battlefields of Europe, the Spanish Tercios had already mastered its use with surgical precision. Born in an era of transition between medieval and modern warfare, they knew how to combine the best of both worlds: the tight, stubborn resistance of the lance-bearing infantrymen and the destructive power of the arquebus. This seemingly contradictory blend became the foundation of their success. The square formation, a human wall of pikes capable of pivoting, resisting, and counterattacking from any flank, was their hallmark. Inside it, musketeers and arquebusiers fired in turns, shooting from the corners or through strategic gaps between the pikemen ranks. The sound was deafening, the rhythm of battle meticulous. Every volley had to be timed to the second. To avoid fatal openings, And while the bullets whistled through the air, the sergeant majors moved through the formation shouting orders, correcting alignments, and striking hesitant men with the flat of their swords. Captains did not command from distant tents. They marched alongside their men, sword at their side, enduring mud, hunger, and enemy fire. Authority in the Tercios was not inherited. It was earned in campaign, sometimes in blood and screaming. The chain of command was strict but permeable. Any soldier with courage could rise. Discipline was law. Desertion was punished by death, theft by mutilation, and disobedience could doom an entire company. But beyond tactics, what made the Tercios truly fearsome was their cohesion, a bloc united not by abstract ideology, but by personal honor, by camaraderie forged in battle, and by the certainty that if one fell, another would step into his place without hesitation. The Tercios did not break apart, they hardened. The weaponry of the Tercios was as diverse as it was functional. The pikemen, the core of the formation, wielded a pike over 4 meters long designed to stop cavalry charges and immobilize the enemy. Protected by a breastplate, backplate, and often a morion helmet, his task was to hold the line at all costs. Beside him stood arquebusiers and musketeers, armed with lighter but deadly mid-range firearms. Load, prime, fire, fall back. A painful cycle learned through discipline, repeated until perfection. These were not armies in lavish uniforms. Their clothes wore out on campaign. Yet each company carried its flag, its drum, its identity. The colors were sacred. To lose a standard was to lose the soul of the unit. In battle, drums dictated movement, halts, and when to fire. Music was tactical. Every rhythm had meaning. And when chaos ruled, the beat of the drum guided men who could see nothing beyond smoke and mud. Unlike the mercenary armies that filled Europe, the Tercios combined technical training with an almost religious morale. The cross, the rosary, and litanies before combat were part of the ritual, but so were blasphemy, superstition, and dark humor. The soldiers of the Tercios were not automatons. They were hardened men, aware of their mortality, but also of their place in history. Compared to the German Landsknechts or French infantry, the Tercios stood out for their adaptability. They could endure on open plains, defend fortresses, or scale city walls. They were not invincible, but they were more complex, more versatile. And that made them feared. Because on the battlefields of the 16th century, where individual bravery still mattered but no longer decided outcomes alone, the Tercios had learned to anticipate the future. They were not just soldiers. They were a thinking machine, the lethal mechanism of an empire that, for over a century, believed itself eternal. When the Low Countries rose in rebellion against the rule of Philip II, it was not a short or limited conflict. It marked the beginning of a long, costly, and merciless war that would stretch over more than 80 years. What began as a revolt, driven by fiscal, religious, and political tensions, soon became a total war, where the Spanish Tercios were sent time and again as the hammer of the empire against the walls of rebellious cities. In 1567, the Duke of Alba arrived in Flanders, at the head of a formidable force. Among them marched the Tercios' disciplined troops, hardened by campaigns against the Moors, the French, and the Ottomans. Their presence alone was enough to command respect. But Flanders was not just a distant province, it was a wealthy, densely populated region filled with well-fortified cities. Haarlem, Antwerp, Ostend, names forever etched in history for the suffering they endured. The campaign for Haarlem was one of the most brutal. The city held out for 7 months under relentless siege. There, the Tercios proved their skill in urban warfare, advancing house by house, gallery by gallery, digging mines beneath the walls while enduring musket fire and relentless hunger. When the city finally fell, the repression was exemplary, not merely out of vengeance, but to send a message to the entire region. Antwerp, on the other hand, offered a different scene, the sack of 1576, known as the Spanish Fury. After months without pay, the soldiers mutinied and looted the most prosperous city in Europe. It was one of the darkest moments in the history of the Tercios, not out of cowardice, but out of hunger and desperation. The empire, crushed by debt, could no longer sustain its most loyal army. Ostend was perhaps the epitome of horror. Nearly 3 years of siege, thousands dead on both sides, disease, foul water, and trenches turned into mass graves. There, the Tercios fought as if death were not an option, replacing their fallen with fresh recruits who inherited their position, their weapon, and even their number. Mud mixed with blood and gunpowder as Spanish engineers opened new breaches underground, while Dutch defenders responded with fire and explosives. The resilience of the Tercios, even in the worst of conditions, became legendary. Soon, across the northern battlefields, a phrase began to circulate among their enemies, a mix of respect and fear. The Tercios are coming. That warning alone was enough to make even the most determined hesitate. Because they were not just soldiers, they were a symbol. Wherever they arrived, the balance of war shifted. But the cost was immense. On top of brutal combat came the relentless weather, endless mud, disease, supply shortages, delayed pay, and political betrayal from Madrid. And yet, the Tercios endured. Sometimes on the brink, at the edge of mutiny, but they held together. Because honor, brotherhood, and tradition were chains stronger than the king's gold. Flanders was the crucible where the Tercios evolved from a professional force into legend. Not always victorious, not always well-treated, but always present. Their silhouette on the horizon, pikes raised and banners flying, meant the fight was not over. The empire was still fighting. The sons of Spain, soaked in mud and blood, still had something to say. And they would say it with steel. Italy, 16th century. A land of princes and popes, of rival city-states, dazzling wealth, and palace intrigues. But also a land of blood. There, between the fields of Lombardy and the walls of Rome, the Spanish Tercios forged part of their most feared legend. In a continent at war, Italy was the main battleground. The ambitions of France, the power of the papacy, the interests of the Holy Roman Empire, and the resolve of Spain collided with fury. And in the midst of it all, they marched not as improvised invaders, but as the elite of an empire claiming its place as arbiter of Europe's destiny. In 1525, the Battle of Pavia would forever change the balance of power. Facing the troops of Francis I of France, the Tercios demonstrated the lethal combination of firepower, maneuver, and discipline. While the French relied on heavy cavalry and noblemen on horseback, the Spaniards dug trenches, lined up arquebusiers and pikemen, and wove a deadly dance to the rhythm of gunfire. When the fighting was over, the French king lay in captivity. Pavia was not merely a military victory, it was the crowning moment of a new model of warfare that placed infantry at the center of modern military art. In 1527, with the city of the popes under siege and no imperial reinforcements in sight, the Tercios, underpaid, starving, and exhausted, unleashed their fury upon the spiritual capital of Europe. What began as a military operation turned into catastrophe, looting, violence, desecration. Rome fell not only to an army obeying orders, but also to hunger, rage, and the dust of endless campaigns. It was the price of glory, the most bitter victory of Emperor Charles V. And yet, the Tercios did not lose their prestige. On the contrary, their legend grew. In the fields of Italy, they became a living myth. The Medici feared them, popes negotiated with them, and the French avoided them. Wherever their banners flew, a name echoed that inspired both respect and dread. Their presence did not just promise a likely victory, it was the brutal proof that the Spanish Empire knew no borders. And though their ranks were filled with men of no noble birth or fortune, The Italian campaigns made them masters of battle. T placed infantry at the center of modern military art. Dawn broke on May 19, 1643, and the fields of Rocroi, in northern France, were just beginning to shake off the morning fog when the war drums of the Tercios thundered one last time, echoing the glories of the past. In front of them stood the young Duke of Enghien, commanding a modern French army determined to strip the Spanish Empire of the prestige that had inspired fear across Europe for over a century. He was only 21 years old, but he knew that this day was not just a battle, it was a declaration of power. The Tercios were there in the name of King Philip IV and the dying Cardinal Infante. The circumstances were grim. The empire was exhausted. After decades of war in Flanders, the nobility was divided and the royal treasury drained. And although experience was still on their side, the world had begun to change. Artillery, mobility, and combined arms tactics, this was the future, and the French knew it. Rocroi became more than a clash of armies. It was a collision of two eras, the age of chivalric ideals and the dawn of modern warfare. The battle began with a devastating French cavalry charge on the Spanish right flank. Their German allies broke and fled. But the center, held by the veteran Tercios of Naples and Lombardy, stood like a rock. For hours, they repelled wave after wave, locked in tight formations, banners raised, firing their arquebuses with deadly precision. When their allies fled, the Tercios were surrounded. But they did not surrender. For hours, the French tried to break the Spanish lines. The Duke of Enghien, astonished by the veterans' resilience, offered them an honorable surrender. The Spanish captains refused. They regrouped into squares, shouted "Santiago and close!" Spain, and counterattacked. Though surrounded and outnumbered, they fought until their gunpowder ran out, until their spears splintered, until their cloaks became bandages. At last, the final survivors accepted surrender, but not at any price. They demanded to be treated as soldiers of honor. The young Duke agreed, and what followed was almost theatrical. The French opened ranks with applause. The remnants of the Tercios marched out in formation, their banners still visible, their drums still pounding. It wasn't a victory, but neither was it a humiliation. It was a farewell. Legend says that on that day, an army died, but a myth was born. Rocroi was not the true end of the Tercios. They remained active for several more decades, but it was the end of their aura of invincibility. From that moment on, Europe understood that even the greatest could be defeated. What did not die? At Rocroi was their spirit, unbreakable discipline, courage in the face of the impossible, and the ideal of service to the king beyond life itself. And therein lies the paradox. Rocroi was a defeat, but one that ennobles. Because only the great fall with greatness. Because true victory does not always lie in the outcome, but in how one fights, in how one dies. And the Tercios, on that 19th of May, did not die like any ordinary army. They died as legend. After Rocroi, the Tercios did not vanish overnight. They continued to fight for decades, though their structure gradually changed with the evolution of modern warfare. But their essence, the Spanish soldier willing to die with honor, the square formation that holds fast even when all is lost, was forever etched into Europe's military memory. Rocroi was, yes, a defeat, but it was also an epic farewell. A final act of greatness that made the Tercios immortal. The figure of the Spanish Tercios stands today at the crossroads between history and legend. Centuries have passed since their peak, yet the fascination with these soldiers has not diminished. Collective memory has turned them into a symbol of invincibility, sacrifice, and perfect discipline, an image shaped as much by historical fact as by the myth built around them. This duality makes it essential to distinguish between what they truly were and what popular history has idealized. The myth of the Tercios speaks of indestructible soldiers, invincible in battle, capable of holding their formations against any adversity and defeating much larger armies. While this image is rooted in their tactical rigidity and the real effectiveness of their formations, their path was not one of flawless victories. The Tercios endured defeats, exhaustion, and internal challenges such as desertion, hunger, poor, pay, and mutinies. And yet, their reputation endured, thanks to their cohesion, adaptability, and the unyielding discipline they managed to maintain on the battlefield for decades. Modern historiography has worked to dismantle certain myths, aiming for a more critical and balanced understanding. Current studies view the Tercios not merely as a military force, but as a complex institution with administrative, logistical, and social structures that contributed both to their success and their eventual decline. This comprehensive perspective allows for a better grasp of the conditions that enabled their rise and longevity, as well as the limitations and challenges they faced. In both Spanish and European memory, the Tercios hold a unique place. They are emblematic of the Spanish Golden Age, a symbol of imperial power and ambition, and a reference point for military honor and resilience. From historical accounts to portrayals in cinema, literature, and contemporary art, the image of the Tercios remains evocative and powerful. They represent a time when the world was constantly changing and when war was an art that shaped the history and destiny of nations. In the end, what made the Tercios truly invincible was not just their weaponry or their tactics, but their collective spirit. A spirit that transcended time and still invites reflection today on courage, discipline, and the enduring legacy of a generation of men willing to live and die for a greater cause. And so concludes this journey through pikes and arquebuses, where the iron will of the Tercios set the rhythm of an era. We have seen how their unbreakable discipline, innovative tactics, and spirit of brotherhood forged an empire that dominated Europe for over a century. But their story does not end here. There are still battles to uncover, political intrigues to unravel, and forgotten figures whose feats demand to be told. In the next chapter, we will explore new campaigns, unexpected alliances, and the cultural legacy these soldiers left behind. We'll meet again soon to continue unveiling the immortal legacy of the Tercios.